Hello, welcome to our fourth and final week of Advent. We're almost done. It's actually gone fairly quickly for me. So we continue our journey around sacred places in the Nativity story. Last week we talked about Jerusalem, the place of our tradition. And this week we're going to talk about Egypt. Now, Egypt is the most surprising sacred place in the story because it's a Jewish boy in a Jewish story, and Egypt is not exactly Jewish friendly. At least that's not what we think of Egypt. But it becomes an important part of the story, and that's why we're calling it the place of irony, because the most beautiful stories have a beautiful sense of irony in it. And that is true, of course, of the Nativity story. Now, the text that connects us with this particular week is found in Matthew chapter 2, and I'd recommend you read that before you read the guide. And it's the story of Herod and the flight to Egypt and back. It's really a fascinating story. And Egypt had changed over the years. By the time of Jesus, of course, Egypt is a place that had a lot of large Jewish population, so it was a safe place for he to go. It was a place of refuge for the Holy Family. But centuries earlier, you never would have guessed it. That's why it's ironic, because Egypt, for most of Jewish history to that point, would have been synonymous with the place that enslaved us. We had to have a miracle to get us out of that place, and now it becomes a safe place. In our, not in our day and age, but in our history, if you're as old as me, you remember the Cold War, right? You remember the Reagan years when in 1983, really to a group of religious leaders, he first used the term about the Soviet Union as, you remember it? The evil empire. And most of us go, yes, they're the evil empire. And it would have been ironic at that time in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s in the Red Scare to say, you know, one day America may get into trouble. And you know where we're going to find our safe place or refuge? Russia. That would be crazy. Still sounds a little crazy. But that's the idea of an irony, right? So Egypt becomes our irony. And Mike writes about a few different characters. My favorite is St. Patrick. He's one of my heroes, who was an Englishman that was literally abducted by Irish pirates, taken into slavery in what we now call Ireland, escapes miraculously because God got him out, and then God sent him back as a priest to be a light for the gospel. So there's beautiful places of irony, and the questions are going to be about irony in your own life. So the three questions that Mike comes up with, the first one is kind of a hypothetical future, and it's a fun one, an interesting one to think about, especially if you're with your family or your kids, and you said, what would it be like if by the end of the year we had to move? Wow, right? Well, that would be a little bit of what Mary and Joseph had to experience. They'd probably been in Bethlehem for maybe 2 years because Jesus was going to be a 2-year-old. And so 2 years kind of rooted there, and all of a sudden you have to flee. Now, the second question is more of a past question, just that idea of having to flee something because God calls you to do that. And maybe there was a relationship that was harmful or a job that was toxic or something. So it'd be time to reflect and talk about it a little bit. And the final question is an interesting one where we kind of apply the whole metaphor of Egypt to our lives. Where is the irony in your life? Now, the language I would use that Mike didn't put in there, but it's the language that was made famous by Henry Nouwen. It's the idea of being a wounded healer. That often the place where you are able to bring the most healing is also the place where you've experienced some deep wounds. The example Mike uses, which is something that we would understand very well here at Volunteers of America, that the people who are best apt to bring healing to someone, for example, with a present addiction, is someone who knows addiction from their past. And as you have experienced that wound and found healing, then that's when you offer it to others. And really, that's the nature of the gospel, that you have Jesus, who is the wounded healer. And for a little extra, I would advise you to read Isaiah, the end of Isaiah 52 and 53. It's called The Suffering Servant, and it gives a picture of the Messiah that is beautifully ironic. Despised, rejected, well acquainted with grief, and yet the one to come and shut the mouths of kings. That's our Messiah. So I'll end with the theme of this week historically in the church is peace. And I hope you have a week of peace. And the other passage that you should read at least once during Advent is Isaiah chapter 9. And in it, it describes 4 characteristics of this one to come. Describes as wonderful counselor, Almighty God, everlasting Father, and then lastly, This Messiah will be the Prince of Peace. And it won't be peace like we tend to think about it or try to make happen or through wars or whatever. It's the way Jesus brings peace. And there's a beautiful irony to it. So have a week of peace, and we'll see you for a short devotion on Christmas Eve. See ya.